Brian will kick off the recording now. Okay. Go ahead, you're on.
Okay. Is everything open? Okay, great. Good afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thanks so much for joining us at this important seminar on unpacking the genocides of the Hazaras in Afghanistan. It is a huge honor to have such distinguished and esteemed guests among us to discuss this issue. And we're also going to talk about why we're discussing this issue right now. So before getting into the details of this issue and this topic, I wanted to introduce our esteemed colleagues who are here today. First, I want to introduce to you Dr. Nazif Shahrani. He's an Afghan-American anthropologist who specializes in political anthropology and anthropological approaches to the study of religion with a focus on Islam. We know that he is a professor at the University of Indiana at Bloomington and one of the world's foremost experts on Afghanistan. Farkhondeh Akbari is a postdoctoral fellow at the Gender, Peace and Security Center at Monash University in Australia. And she completed her PhD in diplomatic studies at Australian National University. And she has extensive experience working in a number of international organizations, including Afghanistan's IDLG, the Independent Directorate of Local Governance, and has worked on vulnerable groups, including women and minorities in Afghanistan. We have Melissa Chiovenda, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi. She's conducted extensive ethnographic fieldwork with Hazara civil society activists in Bamiyan, Afghanistan for many years. And she focuses on the transmission of collective and cultural trauma through activist activities to understand how this shapes and affects political identity. So before going forward, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Ehsan Shayegan, who is going to talk about the activities of PRSO. This is the organization that is co-sponsoring this event today with the Center for Governance and Markets. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Dr. Shahrani, Dr. Melissa, and Dr. Akbari, and our great audience. Thank you so much, and the team, the organizing team, for doing a lot, in the past couple of days, working so hard to make this happen, this event happen. Before going to talk about the PRSO, I'm going to reflect, why we raised this topic and how it really came up to us, to organize this event. I was watching some of the, let's say, the graphics of, unfortunately, the incident and the event that is happening on the ground. And I thought, we have really limited literature, especially on Hazara genocide in Afghanistan, since we have, if you see throughout the history of Afghanistan, unfortunately, we are confronted with the type of selective historiography. And you can see that connection with the power, you can see that, connection with the elites group, and you can see that kind of understanding in the literature. And I thought globally, we need to raise awareness about, let's say, this silent genocide, which is not really getting traction and getting attention at the international level. And then we thought to talk with Jen and with Boris, we came up with this idea. And I can say that Porsesh Research and Studies Organization, which I'm honored to be part of it, and also Dr. Shahrani, we are very delighted to have you on our board. This is an institution that came and emerged out of ruins, out of structural discrimination, and out of, let's say, injustices in Afghanistan. The topics that we are covering since its establishment, you can see these are the topics that no one really cares about in Afghanistan. We try to focus mostly on the minorities, specifically on minorities who are really underrated in the literature. And they haven't been part of that history, let's say the literature in Afghanistan. And the Hazara genocide, what is happening on the ground, unfortunately, in Afghanistan right now is part of that, kind of ignored area, especially that silence that we see, or let's say these silent genocide that's not getting attention. So we thought we organize this event and to debate it and raise awareness and see and also engage the international community, to debate this, to take it to the agenda setting level in order to be part of the policies and part of the literature, at least from the lens and the eyes of the people in the international community who see themselves as humans who are really concerned about such events happening, and to actively engage them and to get them involved to covering and to documenting this all. Yeah, I shut up here and thank you all again. Thank you, Jen, for giving this opportunity.
Thank you. And I should say that the idea for bringing us all together, for bringing these voices together, came from our colleagues at PRSO. And I'm just very grateful that you came to us with this. And we held a Twitter space last week that brought Hazara voices to discuss these issues. I know that you believe, Ehsan John, that it was very important to bring not just Hazara voices, but key academics who are working on this issue. So this is seen as a very important issue, not just for one group, but for everybody who works on Afghanistan. And so this is why we are having, this is an academic panel to talk about this issue in broader context. So I'm going to begin now with Dr. Akbari. I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about what makes this, what's happened lately. Can you talk to us about why this issue is so pressing now? Can you talk to us about the attacks against the Hazara community in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Dr. Jen, and thanks to everyone attending our session, our webinar today, and also paying my respect and greetings to my co-panelists and the organizers. It's very timely to hold this event, and of course, I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Why now? I think we have what we have been observing and what we have seen an escalation of violence, targeted violence against the Hazara community since the Taliban takeover. I mean, this has been happening, this targeted attack against the Hazaras at least since 2011, but more systematically from 2015 onward. But then in the recent years, and mostly in the last 7-8 months, it has been occurring a lot more frequently. So it's not that it has stopped, but the frequency has gotten a lot more, and I think that's just raising the bell and raising the alarms. The community have been raising their voice that they have been targetedly being killed in the country. We do know, I mean, Afghanistan have been a bloodbath in a mess, and different communities, different groups have been killed, different communities at different parts of the country. But what remains distinguished about the Hazaras was that they have been targeted based on their ethnic and religious identity. And how do we know that? Because it's not just the girls' schools that are being attacked. It's not just political gathering or a mosque. It's all of them. It's a school, it's mosque, it is our maternity hospital, it is our political event, it is our protest, and it is the bus and the roads that the Hazaras predominantly cross. And the target have been really mostly the young generation. And this itself, sort of the pattern has been built in the last few years that the communities under attack. And if we take Kabul in particular, the west part of Kabul, the Hazara neighborhood of Dasht-e-Barchi, I think it's in the first 6 months of 2021 alone, there has been 21 different attacks on the community at different places, different parts. And that makes it very distinctive from the rest of the violence that occurs across Afghanistan, and also revealed to us, we knew it ourselves, but to the rest of the world, that the community are being targeted based on their identity, and specifically the young generation of the Hazaras. And in the recent months, I mean, with Taliban coming to power, we have also lost our eyes and ears. I mean, the civil society has been disrupted, and so many other platforms that could really report on these, and the journalists have escaped the country or not allowed and not able to report on it. But we cannot hide this. It cannot be hidden that the numbers are being hidden, that what certain numbers of people are being killed, but the frequency of it, and then the fact that some of these attacks have been very large scale. There have been small ones as well, 1, 2, 3 people killed, but never got reported or got any sort of attention. But then whenever there is a big scale attack that plus 100 people are being killed, and this is where we get some attention from non-Hazaras, be it the international community or other Afghans, for a couple of days, and then it dies off. But I mean, just a few hours ago, there was another attack in Western Kabul, and details are still emerging. And this is turning, unfortunately, into a daily thing, and also in a larger scale. And what is more concerning, that the Hazaras has lost agency. We can no longer take it anywhere. And not that previous government did anything about it, but at least there was a voice, and there was some sort of pressures, and we have lost that.
So Dr. Shahrani, I'm wondering is there something distinctive about these attacks that have happened in recent weeks, or is this just a continuation of things that we've seen throughout Afghan history? You have been such an important chronicler of that history. I was wondering if you could help us contextualize what's been happening. You're muted, unfortunately.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. And also wish to say in advance Eid Mubarak to everybody who has been observing Ramadan. Thank you for organizing this particular panel, the webinar, Jennifer, and also Ihsan Jan, and inviting me. The Hazara issue, of course, in the political dynamics of Afghanistan has been very prominent, although perhaps not given the attention it deserves, but it has been there for the last 140 years at least. It started with Abdurrahman Khan, of course, the so-called founder of this buffer state, in which he was crowned by the British, but he claimed he was chosen by God. And then he established this notion, false one, but an important one with consequences, that the country had to be unified under one king, one God, one culture, one history, one language, one everything. And of course, anyone that he perceived to be against the possibility of creation of such an entity were considered vermin. Literally, that he was going to clean his house and he was going to get rid of them. And of course, after dealing with his own tribesmen, primarily, a lot of Duranis were also killed that he thought were not helpful to him. And then he turned to the Ghaljais and killed and moved a lot of them to different places. And I think his third target were the Hazaras, which of course resulted in mass genocide at the time. The term genocide then was not popular in popular academic discourse or anything. But in fact, what had happened was just that Hazaras were massacred in very large numbers and forced to leave the country. And that, of course, meant about 500,000 Hazaras were moved to Quetta, where today they are sort of victimized, but at the same time thriving community, and also in Mashhad in Iran. And of course, that was the beginning of essentially Hazaras being forced out of the country. And this horror continued with a small shift. Of course, we all know about how they were also sold as slaves in marketplaces throughout Afghanistan, and eventually Amanullah, the grandson of Abdurrahman, came to introduce the liberation of Hazaras, which gained them a lot of respect, especially from the Hazaras. And we know that Faiz Muhammad Khatib, one of the few people who has, of course, not only has become famous because he wrote the history of Afghanistan, but he was also somebody who expressed both gratitude to Amanullah and also, of course, his horrors to Abdurrahman and others. And the story really since then has been one of ignoring them. And of course, what Abdurrahman did, one of the important things that he did, not just for Hazaras, but for the entire country, was rank ordering society on the basis of his own sort of focal point. Those who were Sardars, who were affiliated with him and his family, were at the very top, and then the rest of the other Duranis, and then the Ghalzais, and then possibly some Tajiks and Turkic-speaking people, Uzbeks and Turkmen, and then leaving the Hazaras at the very bottom rank of society and in the order of things. And that's what came to be. That Hazaras also were moved, a lot of them, from central Afghanistan, voluntarily or otherwise, into urban centers where they became the essentially the cleaners of the city, the urban environment, and workers and supporters for well-to-do or semi-well-to-do anyway. And that condition continued until really the breakdown of state under the nominal rulers of Pashtun ethnic group, who did not represent the Pashtuns. And I mean to be very clear about that. That sometimes we think that the whole phenomena has been Pashtun versus non-Pashtun. That hasn't been. It has been the rulers, Pashtun rulers, who have claimed to be representing the Pashtuns, but they did not represent them. They have done a lot of harm, as Abdurrahman did against Pashtuns, and the rest of them also continued to do against Pashtuns. And of course, they did more against other ethnic groups, and particularly targeted the Hazaras. That's the important thing that we have to remember. Things began to change essentially in the late 1970s when the communist coup happened and the state broke down, and that people for the first time felt some sense of autonomy in rural areas, in the peripheries. And that's when I think Hazaras began to show their skills in organizing and coming together, and eventually, of course, producing the Wahdat, Hizb Wahdat, one of the few ethnic groups who managed to pull themselves together under one organization, under Shahid Mazari. And of course, that has been very important. And also the fact that a lot of Hazaras left the country for Iran, not Pakistan. The fact that they didn't go to Pakistan was a good move, because Pakistanis limited the Afghan refugees who went there in terms of getting education, access to resources. And Iran, fortunately, despite its policies that were quite negative towards the Hazaras, they provided them the opportunity to gain education. And I think that has obviously changed the entire dynamics in the country, that Hazaras, who had worked so hard to keep the cities clean, to keep a lot of the work of the country going, showed that they could do also, when given the opportunity, they can produce intellectuals, produce people of value to their own community into Afghan society. And that's why we have, after 9/11 and the return of some kind of governance under Western auspices, that they built a lot of private universities. And the best of them are, in fact, Hazara institutions and research institutions and a lot of other work. And I think that's what has perhaps scared those who have come to rule Afghanistan in the last 20 years, and particularly the Taliban group as well. I don't want to monopolize this. We can come back to this issue in terms of why Hazaras have been targeted. Is not necessarily just internal Afghan dynamics, but also external. What role international community has played in the history of oppression of Hazaras and ethnic minorities in Afghanistan, as well as under Taliban, is something that we can discuss a bit more further.
Yeah, in fact, that was going to be, thank you, Professor Shahrani. That was just an incredible lesson to all of us of this recent history, a very painful history. I was wondering, Melissa, if you could touch a little bit on this, the question that Dr. Shahrani ended with, the role of the international, how are these attacks against the Hazara community different from what we've seen before? Can you speak a little bit to the role of international ideology, global jihad, jihadist ideology? How has that factored into this? And in your view, going back to the question I've asked others, is how are these attacks in recent weeks different from what we've seen before?
You're muted.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so I think I feel like I want to preface everything by saying, at the core, I think that the attacks happen for the same reason, right? I mean, there is an ethnic and religious identity that is the root of the problems that Hazaras have, and I really think that that's the core of it, right? And that can't be escaped, so that's always going to be there. But that having been said, of course, I think you do have all of these different international players that have been impacting the situation in Afghanistan, and that have at certain times and right now kind of led to greater or less problems for Hazaras, right? So, I mean, one thing that we might talk about is the connection to Iran and what happened with the Fatah Mayun Hazaras, who were, either very vulnerable in Iran, or
Can you say a little bit more about that, maybe for some of our viewers who may not be familiar?
Know what they are. Yeah, right. So, of course, there's for a long time been a large community of Hazaras living in Iran, but they don't have any sort of regular documents. So their ability to live in Iran safely and with like all the rights that a legal immigrant should have, it's kind of dependent upon the whim of the government of Iran at any one time, basically, like to put it in a real shorthand, right? So when the war with Syria was really heating up, and when Iran was getting involved there, some of the ways that Iran was finding essentially foot soldiers, right? So the fighters that were like really putting themselves out there and putting themselves in danger was, number one, to call on Shias from other parts of the world, including Afghanistan and including Pakistan, and say, we need you to come and we need you to defend shrines in Syria that are under attack. And some people were going, and this did happen. But another thing that happened were these huge communities of Hazaras who were in a really vulnerable situation, sometimes their children might have access to school, sometimes they might be barred from school, sometimes they might be allowed to work and have a work permit. The next week, their work permit might be revoked, and there was no recourse for them because they were there in a very irregular way. So they started to be offered the opportunity to go and fight in these militias. And so the ones that went out of Iran, from the ones that were living in Iran, Hazaras, were called the Fatimayun, who were, going to guard the shrine of Fatima. And so they were.
To interrupt you here, but hasn't this been used quite a lot against the Hazaras, that they were
exactly
right, so that they're seen as foreign pawns,
exactly,
and that this becomes a slur, right?
Exactly.
Yes. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Yeah.
So the war ended, and you had all these people. A lot of them died, but a lot of them came back, and so to Iran and then to Afghanistan. And so there was this kind of huge fear in Afghanistan that this was not the reality, right? But these like highly trained killer Hazaras were going to be coming back from a war theater, and they were going to be agents of Iran, and they were going to be destabilizing Afghanistan and doing like God knows what. So this helped to spur up kind of a lot of anti-Hazara feeling around that time. Now, there were some people among the Hazara community who tried to say, no, Fatimayun ever came back. This did not happen. Of course, some of them came back. And there's been research done. For the most part, they seem to have integrated rather well. But I don't think that they ever were in any way the threat that they were made out to be. But this sort of fed into this idea of the Hazara boogeyman that was going to destabilize Afghanistan and make problems. This got fed into kind of other localized, I think, conflicts that were happening soon after. So if you remember back to the there's been constant conflicts in Besoud with Kuchis and Hazaras having disagreements over land and whether nomadic Pashtun Kuchis should be able to move across Hazara farmland with their livestock. It results in armed conflict every year. So several years ago, a Hazara commander called Alipur kind of came up and started really fighting back against these things. And there was kind of this specter of the Fatimayun kind of coming around that and who was fighting with Alipur. And in the end, there was a skirmish with the Afghan government with Alipur and his forces that resulted in a helicopter being shot down, which just blew up into a really big problem. And there was a lot of anti-Hazara sentiment that came out of this. So, and Jen, I was listening a little bit to your Twitter bits, and you were speaking a little bit about this issue, right? The Kuchi, and so this was like the government wasn't solving the issue, right? And so this guy stepped in to at least try to do something. And then the way of resolving the issue was like sending helicopters. And of course, it all blew up. And there was.
Yeah, Melissa, let me just, I know Farkhondeh wanted to step in here for a second. I know that you raised your hand. I was wondering if something you wanted to respond to.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I just wanted to flag something, and that is that Afghanistan is a very politically charged country with so much discourse and narratives going on. But we as a Hazara, what we have been always labeled and sort of denied this fact of genocide by labeling us pro-Iran. I always remember that hearing at different events and different places that I have attended as a member of the Hazara community, that back to your question about the time of jihad, that Iran was distributing weapons to other communities to fight the Soviet, but they were distributing photo of Khomeini in Hazarajat. So one has to really look at the substantive support of Iran to Hazarajat rather than the discourse that is there against them. And the substance is that the Hazaras being labeled just because not all Hazaras, but majority of Hazaras have been practicing Shia, that we are a spy or a proxy of Iran. And going back to the Hazara diaspora in living in Iran and then in Pakistan, as Ustad Shahrani mentioned about the genocide from the 1800s, there's a large community of Hazaras in Quetta, Pakistan, that they have been part of the state. I mean, they became Pakistani, or they were gaining citizenship, and they were serving in the army in the very high levels. But we never saw such a thing in Iran. And then this Fatimian project, I spoke to many of them. It's an economic thing for them. It has an economic incentive for a very poor Hazara families living in Iran. I have also lived in Iran as a refugee, where I was not allowed to go to school, and the male members of my family were not allowed to work legally, but work illegally. But when there is an incentive that if you go and fight in Syria, for example, your children will be able to go to school, which is very important for a Hazara family, and that goes back to their fate to change their history of genocide, and also that you get some sort of security and permanent residency in Iran. And that drove those very young boys to be recruited and fight. It was never ideological, and it was never something that the community was signing up for. And even within the Hazara community, there's a lot of stigma and sort of backlash against the people who join, while we do know their vulnerabilities, that because we are as Hazaras progressive and we don't take up arms. So I think those narratives or those labels that are being discussed, we need to take it with a grain of salt and really understand the context, because unfortunately, what really denied the recognition of the Hazara genocide, even not genocide, the targeted killing of Hazaras, was the fact that these labels prevented it. And when we discuss it, we need to be extremely sensitive and cautious.
This is a very important context. This is a very important point. I'm sorry to interrupt, because we don't want to get stuck on the accusations against the Hazara community. I think we want to sort of pivot our attention here to the effect that these attacks have had on the Hazara communities and trying to understand why this is happening. I think, Melissa, some of the points that you brought up are very important for us to understand this animosity and the blame that the Hazara community faces. And I think you've done a really wonderful job outlining why that is the case, because we're talking about a genocide here. And I feel very comfortable using this word because we're looking at the broad historical sweep of history. And as Dr. Shahrani said, this was clear. This was if you look at the past 140 years, we have seen the victimization of this group, and very intentional because of their identity. If we look at the treatment of group and we look at definitions of genocide, it's very clear what has happened to them has been a genocide. And this has ebbed and flowed over time. And, Dr. Akbari, I just want to say, you asked a question. I want to get back here. Melissa, you had an intervention. I want to keep it very brief just to go on to sort of the next questions. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just wanted to follow up by saying where I'm trying to go with this is this was absolutely just used against the Hazaras at that point in time. And I remember both talking to people on the ground and then watching social media. There were things that were being said that were very clear threats and intent to commit genocide against Hazaras based on all this is what was happening, right? I mean, I never saw the Fatimun as any sort of threat, really, myself. It wasn't, to me, wasn't that. But I think, and I'll just say this really quickly, that on the one side, this fear of this sort of group who is somehow coming in from outside. I wonder if there's a way, and this is something I've kind of been thinking on as I've been working also with a lot of asylum seekers, because now you have, of course, people, like a completely different group of people who have been working very closely with international actors, international NGOs, getting right. This group of people, the people who have had to evacuate in such large numbers in August. And it almost seems like there's this sort of taint, right, of foreignness and foreign idea that they're now having to deal with in a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, right? And it's like before it came from the Fatah Mayun and it wasn't really justified, but you heard these horrible calls like, we're going to bring Abdur Rahman back to you. And I heard this said multiple times. And then you heard, you see kind of the, literally bodies turning up on the street, people who are involved in civil society and these sorts of events now currently happening in Afghanistan. Of course, this is happening to everybody, but I worry that with Hazaras, because there is this, again, not valid idea that Hazaras are themselves outsiders, right?
Absolutely.
Hazaras are themselves the people who came from outside, that this all kind of works together in a really pernicious way to make Hazaras very vulnerable.
Great.
To these sorts
Thank
of
you,
narratives.
Melissa. You know what? I'd like to turn our attention now to sort of the way that the Hazara community has experienced a lot of this violence in recent years. And I'm wondering, Dr. Akbari, if you could talk to us a little bit about the impact that this violence has had on the Hazara community.
Thank you, Jen. I think looking back at it historically and then more in the modern history and then in more contemporary time, there's one thing clear, that the Hazara blood is cheap. And why it's cheap? Because it never gets recognized for why it's happening. Even now when Hazaras get attacked, it's never said that Hazara are being attacked. It's only in very, very recent weeks and months that we are seeing the Hazaras, the attacks against Hazaras are being sometimes framed. For this reason, the community feel voiceless for the fact that they have been killed systematically over at least 130 years, but it was never recognized, let alone any step being taken or any perpetrator being brought to justice. And that itself somehow demoralize the community, that look, we live in this country, we work hard, and we have a vision for its future, which is peaceful, which is prosperous, and we have proved that through our action in our communities. But we do not, our pain are not visible to others, and then comes those other open wounds and labels that are attached to us being proxies, this and that, here and there. And all of these is having a very deep, sort of painful impact. I'm in Australia, but I constantly hear it. My mother, who is uneducated, but she always see those attacks in the Tolo News TV, in our TV, and then she talks about it, that the Hazara has no one to talk about them, and I think this lack of recognition about this suffering of the community, and it's not just my generation, it has been intergeneration, is affecting the community and those living so much, and now that it has become a lot more persistent and a lot more targeted, it is also reviving a lot of those traumas from the past, because every one of us at least have had family members being or we have lost or being killed for the fact that they were a Hazara in different episodes of Afghanistan's history, and more recently in post-2001. Hazaras from across Hazarajat, being very poor, Hazara provinces in Afghanistan are probably the least developed and the most impoverished communities in Afghanistan that you can find. I have traveled in some parts of it, and at times I was thinking, is this the end of the world or the beginning of the world, where you only have the mountain and then and the sky? But then there's this aspiration for the young generation that they want to change this. They want to change the fate that their past, their forefathers have bore, and that is that we want to be educated. And that's why we see this Dasht-e Barchi. It's a very small area, but you have probably over 2 million Hazaras living there from across Hazarajat region, and they are very, very poor families.
That's a neighborhood. It's a neighborhood in Kabul.
It's
right?
a neighborhood in Kabul, exactly. And it's also where the attacks happen because they're packed there. It's very small. And then the population is a lot larger than the geographically it could sort of in bed. But why they go there? Because it's Kabul, it's capital city, and then they could access to education centers. And then these attacks have been happening. I know families who have lost all their children in various attacks throughout the last few years. Daughter in one place, another daughter in one place, and then another son in another place. And they ran out of their children going to school. And they've been investing in them because we don't have land in Afghanistan. We don't have any political assets or anything else, but they were investing in their children to be able to change this painful history that we have had towards a brighter future. And now that they are being attacked, these kids are being attacked, I mean, you could imagine the rest, that what impact it is really having on the community. Many families are started to leaving Dasht-e Barchi in Kabul. They can't leave other places, mostly because they're not familiar, and also Dasht-e Barchi is a lot cheaper to rent a place to be there, and now they started to leave and going back to their villages and hometowns, but with absolutely no development or no educational opportunities.
Great, thank you. And I should say that Ahmed Shah Mubaris, he is an economist at the University of Arkansas. He'll be joining us at the Center for Governance and Markets as a postdoctoral scholar in September. And he's done a lot of economic research on the economic plight of the Hazaras and the poverty that they have faced. And so we'll be looking to him to produce more research and be sharing more on this in the months and weeks to come. But Dr. Shahrani, I wanted to ask you, what does this tell us? You know, we've seen these attacks, we've seen the increased escalation of violence against the Hazara community in Afghanistan. What does this tell us about the Taliban? What does this, you know, who is behind these attacks? This has happened so, I mean, of course, these attacks have happened for years, right? This is not new, but the Taliban promised security. They promised security for all. They have made these strong pronouncements, right? They're going to bring order to the country. They'll be the first to do this. They'll protect everyone, regardless of their faith. What does this tell us? Who's behind these attacks, and what does this tell us about Taliban rule?
Allow me to say a couple of things about other issues that came up in the discussions first, and then we'll come to the incidents that are happening currently. One is this, Afghanistan actually has a race issue, which is not generally talked because it's not black and white. When we talk about race in the West, it simply refers to color. In Afghanistan, it's not color, it's feature. And there is a very deep racism in Afghanistan that has been there for a very long time. Historically, I suppose anyone who has Asiatic looks, which Hazaras did, it's changing a little bit in recent times, but historically they shared the same features with Uzbeks, some Uzbeks, and with a lot of Turkmen also. So that there is a history of racism, and very powerful one, and those who take pride in being Aryan that Aryan race, particularly after Hitler's rise in Germany and Aryanism becoming a very important issue. Much of Afghans essentially identified with that, and that had its own consequences against those who did not look like them or had slightly different issues. And I think part of why the Hazaras live together in Dashti Barchi is just that if they were living in other communities, they might be even worse off, so that they feel better when they're together. But one other thing that we shouldn't forget: why are Hazaras in the most marginal of marginal lands in Afghanistan? It tells us something about demography of power in Afghanistan. Those who have enjoyed power and have been powerful have lived in better irrigated with water, land, and everything else. And they're the ones who have pushed basically marginal population, less powerful population, and sometimes populations have really taken refuge for the safety of their own lives into these remote valleys in the high altitudes. I mean, in my case, I studied the Kyrgyz, a very small group, and they voluntarily essentially took up that place to get out of Soviet communist revolution and to just survive. And eventually they came out of it. So we have to keep these things in mind, that Hazara physical demographic locations and situations is part of this racist ideology that is pervasive in Afghanistan. The second thing is virtually all attacks against Hazaras and other minority groups have been essentially instigated by the state. It's state that is responsible. So if a state is responsible for harming its own citizens for varieties of their own reasoning, you cannot expect anybody to voice anything for them in terms of support. Who is going to support if the state instigates? And this is where I think what I suggested earlier on, the role of international community is. The genocide against Hazaras in the 1990s was perpetrated by British weapons and British money. Without that money and weapons from British India, Abdurrahman could have never been able to do what he did. So keep that in mind. And later, in more recent years, it's the same thing. It's the weapons. Now that we just heard last night, more than $7 billion worth of sophisticated armaments are left behind to Taliban by the United States of America. And how are the Taliban going to use this? And the use of that is already clear. So much of these issues that we have not really discussed is in the last 20 years in particular, or last 40 years in general, at least the part that some discussion was made about the emergence of Fatimiyun. In Fatimiyun are essentially part of victimization of the Hazaras, is Farkhondeh mentioned in Iran, that they picked essentially poorest and the most vulnerable and recruited them to go and fight in their war in Iraq, and then later on their proxy war in Syria. So a lot of these poor Hazaras were made to do what they themselves probably would not have chosen to do it, but they're victimized in that sense. The other thing that's very important is I need to mention this, I referred to this earlier, that Iran provided a context for Hazaras to make something of themselves. It was not that the Iranians did it for them. They did it out of their own very struggle, personal and family struggles to improve themselves. And they found the ways, even if opportunity was not there the way it should have been, they made that vulnerability into a situation where they could take advantage of, and they got education, and they got themselves pulled out of the doldrums that they had been there historically for a very long time. One thing that we need not to forget is the first round of Taliban rule in Afghanistan. They were clearly anti-Shia, and enemy of Shiism and Shia, and it also had to do in the regional context, the contest between Iran and Saudis and the sheikhs of the Emirat and so forth. So there was another struggle going on, and Hazaras became basically victim in Afghanistan of that struggle between Saudis and Emiratis and in general sort of Sunni community, which were also being promoted by the West in terms of their own agenda, and then the Iranians and the Shias and the Hazaras being pushed into the lap, is essentially, of Iranians to do certain kinds of things. So you remember that anti-Shia movements that exist in Pakistan for a very long time, that movement also was infiltrated, had infiltrated, I should say, Taliban. In part, some of them were in fact part of Taliban at that point. So that idea of fighting the Shias, fighting the Hazaras, was something embedded within Taliban ideology. That ideology has not gone away. They are pretending that they are no longer that, and that only Daesh is anti-Shia. But who is Daesh? Daesh is Taliban, renamed, rebranded. They're not different. And one other very important thing that you have to remember is amongst Taliban, there are groups, subgroups, who have articulated clearly that their job is to kill Shias and Hazaras. You remember Mullah Niazi in Herat, who was killed recently under whatever pretext. He has clearly stated that his job is to eradicate the Hazaras and Shias from Afghanistan. So do you think Mullah Niazi's death ended that? By no means. He had a very large group of followers, and that they are probably there doing Mullah Niazi's job. And they're probably doing it to appease, in their own minds, anyway, in their own crooked minds, that they're going to, by killing Hazaras, they're appeasing the soul of their leader who fell in Herat recently. And there are many, many more Mullah Niazis amongst Taliban. And you remember, Taliban is not a coherent group. It doesn't matter what they say in Qatar, in Doha, and their leaders in Kabul has no resonance with the middle range leaders, or let's say the older range, those who are in the cabinet posts now. And they have no resonance also amongst ordinary Taliban with guns in their hands, in the streets and in the villages and everywhere, that they are there essentially to do their own bidding. And they are hateful of Hazaras, hateful of Shias, hateful of other ethnic minorities in general. So whether they are Tajik or whether Turks or whether they are, again, these days, Pansheris or Andarabis or whatever, there are all kinds of new notions coming into being. So we need to remember that what goes on these days in Hazara communities in terms of the indiscriminate killing is multifaceted, but it's embedded within Taliban ideology and within the policies of Afghan state since the 1890s. It's nothing new, and it has different manifestations, but it's the same structural problem that has existed and will exist, unfortunately, with us for some time to come, as long as Taliban and the likes of them are in the top of the running this something called state, although they are not really government or state or anything. They're a bunch of occupiers of the country with the help of, again, foreign powers.
And so this takes us to, we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I'm very grateful for so many of them. I've never seen a webinar with such active participation by audience members, and thanks to all of you. We'll try to get to your questions. And I think the big question that everyone's asking here is, what can be done about this? I know a lot of people are saying the international community can act, but I want to throw in some skepticism here. The international community has been trying to have an influence in Afghanistan for a very long time. the past 20 years, the international community had a huge role, United States especially, wasn't able, to really implement its vision. It's a really hard time, and it's easy to say, okay, the UN, the United States could do something, but I'd like some hard talk here about what really can be done, because I'm not just convinced that going to the UN and raising this issue is going to have much of an influence at all, given how hard this is, and given how the Taliban have shown their unwillingness to compromise, to make deals. I mean, we look at the issue of sanctions right now, and I don't mean to be giving a speech, but the Taliban have so many things in their hand that they could do to change the situation very quickly. And they're choosing not to. They're choosing not to compromise. They're choosing not to give in to any kinds of demands. So what makes us think that the Taliban will do anything differently, given these constraints? Farkhondeh, could you tell us a little bit about what you think should be done? What could be done?
Yeah, thank you for a really good, but of course, hard question. As you mentioned, there are very limited options on what could be done. We had some 40-something countries involved in the country, and with US presence of over 100,000 international troops and so many organizations. But now it's also time for us to recognize that one of the failures of the last 20 years was that the international community failed to recognize and protect vulnerable communities in Afghanistan, and that is the one of a main one, the Hazaras, because as these attacks were happening against the community, especially post 2015, we had the intelligence of many countries in the country, we had the embassies, we had human resources, but nobody really invested on this area. And it's not that the community did not raise their voice, we really did, but nothing much was done. So now, with absence of a foot on the ground, it's a lot harder. But number one, I would suggest, and I think this is a practical step to go ahead on how to tackle this, is acknowledgement and recognition of the targeted against the Hazara community in Afghanistan. This is the bare minimum, and we have not even achieved this bare minimum yet. So international community, be it states or international human rights organizations, who do these are parts of their values, that there is a targeted killing of certain ethnic groups happening in Afghanistan, and that needs to be acknowledged and recognized. All evidence are there on the ground, even though we have lost journalists and civil society, but we do have enough members on the ground, the community members and organizations, grassroots organizations that are showing evidence or sharing evidence that there are targeted killing. The acknowledgement and recognition is very, very important. First, to be able to document this. Secondly, to gain sort of that political will and that next step for prevention, and then eventually for accountability. I think we have been seeing statements recently, even one statement made by, for example, the Holocaust Museum, that talks about the nature of the attacks on Hazaras as genocidal act or anything that sort of gives hopes to the community that what is happening to them on the ground is being recognized or is being investigated on. Even not being on the ground, I think they can do that. And secondly, documentation. We need to document the crimes that are happening against the Hazaras. Even the numbers that are killed, they are remaining unknown. The attacks that happened like a few days ago, it remains unknown that how many were really killed. Yes, the Taliban are in power, we have lost journalists, but we do have enough resources on the ground that could tell us exactly how many were killed. And those international platforms and bodies and organizations, if they pay attention to this, we can get numbers, we can get evidence, we can get information about the nature of this crime. And these itself will lead us to finding out who the perpetrators are. Ustad mentioned about the state being involved, of course, but there is also the politicization of the attacks on Hazaras. If you see, go back and look, whenever there's an attack, yes, ISIS claim, but then there's the government was claiming it was Taliban. Taliban was claiming it was the government, former government, and then now they're saying that it is the resistance group. It has always been politicized. Why? Because there is no evidence, no concrete evidence that one can draw upon. I think these are things that has to be looked upon, and we're not expecting troops on the ground or something to protect us or provide a green zone, but something as practical as paying attention, recording at the database of attacks that happens on the Hazaras, the numbers killed, and talking to the people on the ground about how they are happening. And all of this will give us enough evidence to go to the next level, which is finding the perpetrators, the prevention measures, and then take accountability measures.
So along these lines, Melissa, I'm wondering if you could tell us about what can international human rights organizations do? What can be done to chronicle these events? What can be done to raise awareness about what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's like we've already said, it's hard right now because there's a lot of people who were on the ground who are no longer on the ground, and there's a lot of people who risk a lot. But I think there are ways to still find out what's happening. I mean, we have all sorts of ways to talk to people. I talk to people in Afghanistan every day, and I ask them what's happening. And, I think that this sort of data needs to be taken more seriously. Like we all know with the last bombing of Abdurrahim Shahid School, the numbers dead are absurd, right? 6 people. I don't know. I'm hearing, what are you talking about? 6 people? I saw hundreds of bodies. I saw bodies piled in containers. And yet for some reason, media keeps repeating 6 people were killed, 6 people were killed. So I think that
who's behind that claim? Just the Taliban government trying to?
As far as I can make out, the Taliban is saying that. So, why, and I'm saying to myself, why are we accepting this? Like, why, and maybe this is, we all have stuff going on. Maybe we need to push back at the New York Times and these other media outlets. They just keep repeating 6 people. And, 6 is the official figure, but other people say it's not even that, right? I just keep seeing 6 people, six people killed. So, I think we just maybe need to kind of expand what we accept as permissible data in a situation like this. I remember, several months ago, there was a talk with Bill Maley, and he was talking about a similar issue with Cambodian refugees who were telling stories of atrocities, but it was never backed up, but there were never, nobody was actually on the ground to verify. And then, like, lo and behold, once everything settled down and the correct organizations were able to go and do that verification. In fact, it wasn't like they were all lying. It wasn't like the numbers were all inflated. So maybe we do need to believe a little bit more of the victims. So that's those are things I think we can do. Longer term, and I don't know, I just want to put this out there because I've been feeling this more and more. I think that there needs to be more of a push, and this is happening, to recognize Abdurrahman's genocide in international parliaments and congresses around the world. There are efforts being made in Canada, in the UK, in different places. And I think, I know that this is not going to save people now, but I think in the long run, if you have some sort of institution saying, yes, there is a history of Hazara genocide, this means in the future, the next time it comes up and Hazara starts saying, but this is a genocide, or we're at risk of genocide, I think there's going to be a lot more attention, right? Than right now, where there's always been this kind of like, but can you really call that a genocide? I mean, you know exactly what I mean, because I studied Afghanistan through a period where I went through, nobody talked about Hazara genocide when I started studying Afghanistan. Nobody talked about it. The word genocide wasn't used. When I wrote my dissertation, I was told, don't use the word genocide because it's inflammatory. I mean, you know, and I had to kind of work all this out for myself, just listening to my interlocutors, and I'm really happy that it's gone in that direction. But I think that having institutional recognition would also be really, really important for the long run.
Thank you, Melissa, on that. You know, and I think one idea that I've heard come up, Farkhondeh mentioned, I think it was you who mentioned, Farkhondeh, the Holocaust Museum, you know, raising this, and I think this allyship with different groups, because one of the things that we really see when genocides occur is the scapegoating, right? The scapegoating, calling the victims pawns of other foreign regimes. You know, this is exactly what happened during the Holocaust. And you cannot escape this narrative that Melissa, you brought up. This is the narrative, the scapegoating of these groups that justifies the killing. And
exactly, and so easily feeds in then the dehumanization, and then it just goes from there, you know.
Exactly.
And
yeah, Dr. Shahrani, I was wondering if you could tell us, you know, your thoughts as an experienced advocate and scholar on Afghan issues. Yes, you wanted to respond anyway, but please make your point, and then I have another question for you just about what can be done, because I think many of us there's a great sense of frustration right now.
No, I was actually trying to also address that question of what could be done. International community, I think, has proven that they're not going to be able to help anybody, especially ethnic minorities in Afghanistan. They have always helped the rulers, essentially, whoever they were. In fact, they have made some of the rulers of Afghanistan. They have pulled them out of nowhere and brought them and imposed them on the country. So that has gone on. And they're promoting war, not peace. So one of the things I think that we have to learn is Afghans, and I'm calling also on Hazara communities, that they have to have bolder leadership. And the message is clear that there is no military solution to Afghan conflicts. So if there is no military solution, then what are our options peacefully to let the international community know? And that is, we need to learn a lesson from what Shahid Mazari did. And Mazari is the only hero that the Hazara community has produced in all of its history in Afghanistan. There is no other Hazara hero. Go look through history. There is no one. The first one is Shahid Mazari. And what did he do? He tried to make peace with Taliban. He was negotiating peace with Taliban, and he was murdered by Taliban. We should not forget that, and that's what made him a hero. What needs to be done under these circumstances? The Taliban are saying they're there protecting security and safety. Somebody from Hazara community, or many bodies from Hazara community, should step forward and establish or create a movement, a peaceful movement, calling for change, calling for inclusion. And I'm calling on teachers, on students, on university students. I said this the other night in an interview on television. Why are students and professors in Kabul University, in Kabul Polytechnic, are not on the campus, on the streets, protesting the policies of segregation? Why are they not doing that? What's keeping them? Test the Taliban's call for providing security. If they're providing security for peaceful protest and letting the Afghans know, as well as the international community know, what their issues are, what their solutions are for the country to get out of this horrible condition of occupation force, pretending to be a government and not providing any services to the population, not doing anything for the people other than imposing themselves on the population. That's what people in west of Kabul and everywhere in Kabul should do. A peaceful march, day after day after day. They're not allowing the women. 20 of them get out and look what they do. Test them. They're not tested so far, and they're getting away with it. I think larger and larger masses of people need to be out on the streets, and we need bold leaders from the Hazaras as well as from other communities to be willing to challenge the Taliban peacefully on the streets. If they don't, there is no other solution. And this is what, if they do, we call on international community to support them and make it possible. This is what we need. We need more Mazaris who are willing to put themselves online and demand a positive social change in Afghanistan. If they don't, they can wait and be killed, one by one and little by little, and will not have a voice in the politics of that country.
Great. And so basically what I'm hearing from you is that this change has to come from within right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, we're getting many pleas here about having the UN, writing to the UN, calling on the US to do something.
We have done enough of those and have gotten us nowhere. I think that would be a false expectation. We really need to do, and if need be, there should be also an armed struggle next to it. But there should be certainly a political, peaceful one preceding that. If they are not listening, for the last 8 months, they have not listened. And I think the armed struggle is beginning to spread in different parts of the country. We know there is censure. The Afghan media is not reporting a lot of these things, but I do hear from people on daily basis that there are, in fact, resistance movements in different parts of the country going on. So, but I think besides that, we need a peaceful movement in Kabul, in Dashti Barchi, and everywhere else. We need bold leaders from the community to come forward, not just sit down and compromise with them.
Yeah,
Can I add something
please?
here?
Yes, and I just want to underscore this one more time though, right? Is that these old solutions, there's very little likelihood that they will work. There has to be new ideas. Just going to the UN, just asking the US to do something, Human Rights Watch isn't going to change anything, unfortunately. I'm sorry, Farkhondeh. Please.
No, thank you, Jen. I think I'm agreeing with everything that Ustad said, but I think the people's hands are tied at their back. We saw social movements happening in Afghanistan, and the Hazaras were leading it, especially the two social movements, Tabassum movement and Junbish Roshnai movement. One was on this targeted killing of the Hazaras, where 7 passengers were beheaded, including a 9-year-old girl, Tabassum, whose name the protest was named after, where hundreds of thousands of people marched. And then the Junbish Roshnai, where the Hazaras from all provinces and they marched in different cities, but especially in Kabul, asking for equality. But then the suicide attack happened. And this was something that the people were saying, that the Hazaras are saying, that we used to think that we have streets to raise our voice, but we no longer even have the street. So even gathering together and raising their voice in groups and numbers, it's a threat to them. I mean, if I was living there, would my family would allow me to go and participate in those political movements or social movements? knowing that there is such a high risk that there will be an attack and suicide attack. The attack that happened on Jumbish Roshnai really killed the motivation for any sort of uprising and social and political movement for the Hazara community in Afghanistan. And it's very, very unfortunate. And over there, that movement was not only against the state and the government and the discriminatory policies, but their own leaders, their own representatives. But here we are faced with something so harsh as death that any moment, any attack could happen. And that's why I think taking it back to the international community, that acknowledgement, recognition would probably be one step ahead. But of course, I agree that on the ground, the people do have to do something. And the people, the Hazaras, do say that the knife has reached our bone. We have a saying, they do want to do something, but what is the cost? And the cost have already been in their life, and several of them from each family member. At this kind of situation, what else is there? And here I want to call to other Watandars, to other ethnic groups in Afghanistan, to side with the Hazaras, to call out these attacks against the Hazaras, that they are targeted attacks, and come together and do something about this targeted killing of the community.
Great, Melissa, and then Dr. Shahrani will wrap up with you, and then Ehsan John will allow you to have sort of the final words here. Melissa.
Thank you. I had to follow on Farkhondeh. Many of you might know, and some of you might know, the heart of my research were protests that happened in Bamiyan, but were precursors to Jumbish Roshnai. And I just, what Farkhondeh just said, it resonates me that, I mean, I study trauma, and I study collective trauma, and I study collective trauma as it is kind of transmitted through protest. When that explosion happened in the Mazang Square, it was like it broke something in a movement that was so beautiful and so strong, and it's not come back. And so I don't know, maybe somebody here can start to brainstorm and think, like, how do we get over? I mean, how do Hazaras get over those who were out there on the street? Something that was so traumatic that it really did break something. It was broken after that. And I know there have later been kind of other small scale things and online, but that was never regained. And maybe the answer is trying to reach out and get other co-ethnics behind them. Maybe the answer is to kind of broaden the base. But given what happened, asking people to go onto the streets, I mean, I know Mazari put himself out there and he paid the ultimate sacrifice, and every Hazara knows that. But like, we don't have to ask every Hazara to do the same thing, and we shouldn't have to ask them to do the same thing, because we've seen what happened. And
right, and so for those who don't know, that the De Mazang attack, it was 2016, led to deaths of upwards of 100 people. Hundreds and hundreds were wounded, and it was attack on peaceful protesters and young people in the capital. And so it is something that looms large. It was a horrific attack, and it's one that I think hard for many of us to forget. Dr. Shahrani, I don't know if you want to say something. Yeah.
Yes, you remember that particular incident was perpetrated by Taliban, and the government essentially at the time claimed that they couldn't provide safety and security. And Taliban have been essentially a cause of not allowing people of Afghanistan to voice their protests and their concerns during the 20 years of that corrupt regime. And I think they were responsible for the corruption and abusive behavior of that regime. And eventually, of course, they managed to succeed them. And that's a pity. That's a horrible thing to do. But you remember, they are now in power, supposedly. They're claiming security. So if they are claiming security, they should be able to provide security for people who are willing to protest peacefully and call for something. But you also remember the goal of terrorism is to instill fear. Fear is the worst enemy there is. They succeeded in putting the fear of death or whatever it is in people, and have succeeded. And if they continue to be successful in instilling fear in people so that they don't voice their concerns, they don't come out to the streets anymore, then they have won. They have completely won. It's nothing new. And I think we need to, and it's not just the Hazara issue, it's the issue of everybody in Afghanistan who stands against the Taliban. Our Pashtun brothers, our Tajik brothers, our Uzbek and Hazara and Turkmen brothers, our Nuristani brothers, Baluch brothers, all of them, and sisters and mothers should be out there together and create a mass movement across the entire country to peacefully protest and not let Taliban to put this fear in people's heads and not allow them to do anything. And if we're paralyzed as a nation, fear and fearful of all of them, then there is nothing to be done. International community has proven they're not going to come and do anything. America is not going to go again, as they say, to Afghanistan. So what are the options? Are we going to essentially just lie down dead and let the Taliban as they do? If that's the option, so be it. And the other option is, as I have indicated already, they're going to kill one by one. They're going to kill slowly. So we don't have much of an option other than taking up arms as well as protesting peacefully, and let them choose which one. Otherwise, there is no way out. Sorry.
That's very powerful, Dr. Shahrani. Thank you for that. Thanks to all of our panelists for being here. Thanks to all of the audience members who have asked such incredible questions. We've had a huge turnout today for this conversation. I've learned so much from all of you. Ehsan John, I don't know if you want to wrap up. Are there any points, any things that you'd like to share before we conclude?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank, Dr. Shahrani, Dr. Melissa, and Dr. Farkhondeh, and also you for such a professional moderation. And, the event, I think it has two major messages. The first thing is that, there are a lot of conspiracies going on the media. Like, you see a lot of events have been created in past 2 weeks. So I just want to say that the international community, if they want to hear about Hazaras and their accounts and the suffering that they are going through, this is, as a member of the Afghan civil society, I can say with full confidence that this is the most impartial, let's say, reflection on what's happening on the ground. And that's it. And thank you so much for, wonderful job. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks to you, and thanks for many of our friends in Afghanistan who are watching this, who are protesting, who are actually, reporting about explosions as this event is unfolding, and it's heartbreaking to watch. So thank you, thanks to all of you for your time. And we'll be holding more events on this topic and other topics. We'll share more information about the Afghanistan project that we're running here. We're resettling a number of scholars here to the University of Pittsburgh. We have quite a large community that's coming. And we hope that all of you will engage with the scholars that we have. And we'll be sharing more information about these partnerships in the weeks and months to come. So thanks to all of you. Thank you so much for your insights. And thanks to our colleagues at CGM for putting this together as well.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you.